All right. I know there's a lot going on in this module, so I think it's worth it to again just kind of recap and take stock of where things stand. One thing you've probably noticed is that there are a lot of different ways that we can understand futility. There's a lot of debate about how to um, hash it out, and that only some of those are non-normative or don't involve sort of value judgments or um, moral assessments of some kind. Uh, we started off with a couple of understandings that are, and then several that are not. And there seems to be a good consensus that the really difficult cases are the um, cases where there is some kind of life prolonging taking place, or there is some sort of physiological effect going on, but where there's a sense in which the treatment is not worth it. So, as much as medicine would like to move away from those kinds of decisions and have sort of attempted to do so by talking about treatment that's non-beneficial uh, instead of futile, we should sort of be aware that that move doesn't really have those implications. We're still in this position, and you'll see it in the film again that oftentimes those are cases where we're talking about treatment that will be non-beneficial, that is going to be non-beneficial in some sort of normative sense. It's sort of not going to give the patient what they want. It's not that it's not going to have some kind of physiological efficacy, or that it might not, or that it's not going to keep them alive slightly longer. It may well do that. It's just that it's not worthwhile in some respect. Now, you might also have noticed several positions that a person might argue for. You might argue that physicians are actually obligated to refuse to provide fetal care. We just saw that from Drain and Coulihan. Murphy has a similar kind of view. And then we saw Younger's criticisms of Murphy, although Younger and Murphy are really talking about who should make those decisions as opposed to what physicians are actually obligated to do. You might also think that physicians are not obligated to provide fetal care, but that it's permissible for them to do so if they wish, and if there's certain kinds of funding available for it and that sort of thing. That's not a view that we're going to see argued for here, but you might think that that's a view that can be defended. And the reason that we should keep that in mind is that even if we get an argument that physicians don't have this obligation to provide fetal care, you might still think that it's okay for them to do it. Drain and Coulihan don't think that, but you might disagree with them. You might think that it's not an obligation, but it is a permissible action. It's something that is morally acceptable. There's nothing wrong with doing it. And then you might also think that physicians are, under certain conditions at least, obligated to provide fetal care. And there's kind of the very sort of cheap, simplistic argument that, yeah, physicians are obligated to provide fetal care because they're obligated to provide whatever care patients demand. We already think that that's not true, so that's probably not the basis of the argument for an obligation to provide fetal care. It's got to be something more subtle than that. And that's what we're going to wrap up with, is this argument from Veitch and Spicer that there are certain cases where providing medically fetal care is something that physicians are obligated to do. However, they're going to really limit that. They think that fetal care is obligatory only when the patient is one that no one else is willing to take over, so there's no way you can transfer the case to someone who is willing to provide the treatment. It's sort of you're it. The treatment in question is life-prolonging, and the treatment is not burdensome. And there are reasons for each of these criteria. What Veitch and Spicer want to do is allow some measure of respect for physician autonomy. They want to say, look, if a physician doesn't feel right about providing a certain course of treatment, if they deem it to be futile, they have a certain amount of autonomy here. They have a right to not provide treatment that they believe to be medically inappropriate. And so long as they can find someone else who doesn't have that view and who's willing to take on the case, they can sort of exercise their autonomy without denying the patient what they've requested. So you're only going to get an obligation to provide fetal care in cases where you can't sort of transfer the case to someone else who doesn't see the care as futile, because then you really do have an obligation to that patient that you can't sort of get out of. They also think that the treatment in question has to be life-prolonging. They want to make the case, as we've seen, that when treatment is not life-prolonging, then that's a kind of medical futility that is the purview of physicians. They say, look, and we're talking about a treatment that isn't going to prolong life in any relevant way. That's something that physicians do have authority over. They can say, no, I'm not going to give you a course of treatment that isn't going to prolong your life. They think that's a sort of medically appropriate, justifiable position. So we've got to be talking about cases where the treatment in question would be life-prolonging. And it's also got to be the case that the treatment is not burdensome. It can't be something that would sort of harm the patient or make them worse off than they would have been. It can't have sort of dangerous side effects and things like that. So notice that here, Veitch and Spicer give us the view that in the Helga Wangley case, fetal care actually was obligatory. Physicians were obligated to provide it because they tried to transfer the case and they couldn't. The treatment was life-prolonging. It did keep her alive for a really long time, and it wasn't burdensome because she's in a persistent vegetative state. Nothing is burdensome to her, and she can't feel any pain. She has no conscious experience that we know of. So Veitch and Spicer give us the opposite kind of view from what we've seen already about Helga Wangley. They'll bring up some other criteria later that are actually going to turn out to rule out fetal care for Helga Wangley. But Helga Wangley, at least with regard to these criteria, is going to be a case where fetal care is obligatory. And really what they're trying to do here is not only sort of restrict their discussion to cases that are these sort of cases of normative futility, where there's this kind of value judgment being made about whether the life that's ongoing is worthwhile, not about whether it actually would be ongoing. But they also think those are the really hard cases, right? They think that the other kinds of cases are cases that are sort of the proper purview of physicians because they really are just sort of biologically useless. But in these other kinds of cases, those are the hard cases, right? So they sort of contrast with Drain and Colohan in thinking that these kinds of choices are just really a part of medicine. They're worried that maybe they're not, or at least that they're challenging in a way that the other cases aren't. They're going to provide two arguments for this position that there are cases where fetal care can be obligatory. The first one is called the argument from offense. And we're going to take a look at this argument, and then we'll sort of save the second argument for the last lecture clip. So this argument goes like this. They say if a patient demands treatment that's futile, and their physician regards futile treatment as a violation of her integrity as a physician, so the physician sees it as sort of medically inappropriate or irresponsible, bad medicine, something like that, then no matter what course of action is pursued, there's going to be an offense of some kind. Someone is going to be wronged. If the patient demands fetal treatment and they don't get it, the patient will be wronged or offended. There will be an offense committed against them. And if the physician provides treatment that they see as medically inappropriate, as a violation of their integrity as a physician, then the physician will be wronged. So no matter what we do, there's going to be an offense. Someone is going to be subjected to an offense of some kind. And they say, look, when every available course of action is going to produce an offense, what we should choose is the course of action that involves the lesser offense. So when no matter what you're going to do, you're going to cause some kind of harm or offense, some kind of negative consequences, you should choose the course of action that's the least bad, basically. That's a pretty plausible principle, you might think. The whole argument swings on this third premise, that forcing people to die against their will, which is what would happen if we refuse a request for fetal treatment, is a greater offense than forcing healthcare providers to provide services they're personally opposed to. They don't give much of an argument for this claim. I think they find it intuitive and obvious. And at first glance, you might think that's true, but you also might think that this is an inaccurate way of characterizing a refusal to provide fetal treatment. Because if the treatment in question really is futile, you're not really forcing people to die against their will. Their disease is doing that. There's no sense in which you're sort of imposing death upon them, and like it would be avoided by the fetal care. Although if it's life-prolonging, perhaps this is the right way to frame this. The point here is just that although this does seem like a pretty plausible claim, you might be a little suspicious of the way that they've put the third premise, that it's a little bit question-begging to describe a refusal to provide fetal treatment in those sorts of terms. But if you accept all those premises, you're going to get the conclusion that when patient and physician are at odds, the patient's request for fetal care should be honored, on the grounds that no matter what course of action is pursued, there's going to be some kind of offense, and the lesser offense is making the physician do something they don't want to do. And again, that's only going to apply to this very sort of narrow range of medically fetal cases, but it's going to apply to a lot of sort of persistent vegetative state cases and things like that. Those aren't the kinds of cases that we see in the film Facing Death, but they're definitely the sorts of cases that come to mind when people think about fetal care as kind of a burden on the medical system and that sort of thing. All right, so the question that you need to answer is actually about the argument from offense, so just take a minute and make sure you're clear about that, and then we will move on to Veach and Spicer's second argument and just sort of summing up and reiterating why this is sort of interesting for thinking about death and dying in general.